Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. This is part 2 of my 3D printing for beginners series. In part 1, I went over how I modeled and printed a lock washer for my next level racing GT Lite sim racing seat. If you haven't seen part 1, check it out for more background information on the issue and details on how to get Fusion 360 and Prusa Slicer. In this second video, I'm going to go over how I iterated my design to match more closely to the seat, and I'll be showing you the final results. Let's get started. Alright, so the first thing I did was go back into Fusion 360, and on the bottom left, I selected my second sketch. This is a sketch I made for that water drop feature. Since I didn't see any overhang getting into the circle for the bolt, I decided to reduce the gap between the hole and the horizontal line to 0.4 mil. I then went back to my first sketch and started working on some chamfers that I'll be using later for reference. I did this by selecting the line tool to make lines on each corner and then dimension them to be 45 degrees from the horizontal, which is within the capabilities of the printer I'm using. Next, I separated the edges of this line to 19 millimeters, which is a little bit wider than the outer diameter of the knob. And finally, in order to center this line, I dimensioned it to be 3 millimeters from the edge of the part. With that completed, I went ahead and made the most important change, which was to reduce the diameter of the teeth from the calculated value to 38.8, which was what I measured. And now with all the changes completed on the first of 3 iterations, I exited the sketch, went to bodies, and saved as mesh. And finally I saved it as GT Washer 200 to remind me that the pitch of the teeth is 2.00 mils. For my second iteration, I went back to my first sketch and changed the pitch to be 2.25. This is going to compensate for the tolerance on the printer. As I exited the sketch, I noticed a small sliver in the body, so I went to my first extrude to see if I could fix it. One option would have been to have just removed the sliver from the extrude, but I would have been left with a sharp corner. Instead, I decided to go back to my first sketch and extend the line that made up the last tooth. With the extension selected, I used the mirror feature to replicate this change on the other side by referencing the center construction line. Now I could go back to my first extrude and deselect the pieces that made up the sliver. I repeated this on the other side as well. Lastly, I deleted one of the corners in order to keep an identifying chamfer. I exited the extrude feature and went back to the body to save as mesh. This time I saved the file as GT Lite Washer 225 to remind me of the 2.25mm pitch. Lastly, for my third and final iteration, I went back into my first sketch and changed the pitch to 2.50. Then I went into my first extrude where I deselected the extensions that had formed and also the top right corner. Now at this point my final iteration was complete, so I went ahead and saved as mesh again. I saved the file as GT Lite Washer 250 to remind me of the 2.5mm pitch in the teeth. Now that I was done with all the modeling, I went back to Prusa Slicer and dropped in the 3 files that I just created. I then rearranged all the parts similar to how I had done in part 1 of this series. At this point you can see how the chamfers help differentiate each of these parts. The last thing that was left to do was to stand all these parts up and slice them for the G-code. I noticed after the fact that I had used the wrong side of the water drop to stand the parts up on. And into the 3D printer they went. So here's the first of the 3 iterations. I can tell that this was the 2mm pitch because there's no chamfers. Again, I can tell that I printed on the wrong surface because the peak of the drop is flat while the circle has drooped in a little bit. As I compared it to the black groove part, I could see that the radius was much better than it was before, however the teeth still weren't lining up very well. Next, I checked the single chamfered part, which had the 2.25mm pitch. Comparing it to the black part showed a really good match. It wasn't 100% perfect, but definitely usable. Now as I checked the last part with the double chamfer and the 2.5mm pitch, I could see that there was still a big gap between the pitch on the teeth and the pitch on the black part. So that brings me back to the second iteration with the single chamfer and the 2.25mm pitch. Again, a side-by-side comparison shows a really good match between the teeth. However, I know it can still be improved upon. So the last change I wanted to make wasn't for the matching of the parts, but instead I wanted to introduce some sort of error proofing. So I made a sketch on the side of the part, and now I'm making lines on the edge that I'm now considering to be the top. I then made another chamfer line, dimensioned it to be 45 degrees from the horizontal, and lined it up to the original chamfers that I had made. And now the last thing that I did to the sketch was make sure that my lines were coincident to the edge of the part. And now with my sketch completed, I went to the extrude feature and selected the chamfer that I just made. I used the cut operation and toObject extend type so that I could select the chamfer on the other side of the part and have it trimmed till there. Now here's the final result. I went ahead and saved it as mesh so that I could import it into Prusa Slicer. And this is the name of the file that I'll be uploading to Printables and Makerworld. Now, I'm not planning on printing this part, but hopefully you can see in Prusa Slicer how adding that last chamfer makes it a little bit easier to know which surface to place on the bottom. Now, another part that my GT Lite sim racing seat was missing was the shifter plate. However, I was able to find a great option uploaded to Printables by Jonathan Zlotnikov. I highly recommend that you search through websites like Printables and Makerworld for 3D files that you can then insert into Prusa Slicer and print. Here's my GT Lite sim racing seat with all the changes. If you have any questions or suggestions about this video, please leave a comment and I'll reply as soon as I can. My goal is to get 100 subscribers by the end of the year, and I'd be extremely grateful if you would consider being one of my first subscribers. I also want to thank SirCabbages for letting me use his 3D printer. I'll add a link to his printables page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll catch you on my next video.